but I want to specifically address the family members that are here. There is no theory of the prosecution, Mr. Schiff, because there is no prosecution. There's a very big difference between a prosecution where you already have reached a conclusion and you're just trying to prove it to people. This is an investigation, which is why it's so sad that nowhere in that stack that you just put up there, where the emails of Secretary Clinton, the emails of the ambassador, 50,000 pages worth of documents, eyewitnesses, that's the real tragedy. To the family and the friends, when you're told that there have been 7 previous investigations in an ARB, you should immediately ask, why did you miss so many witnesses? Why did you miss so many documents? This is not a prosecution, Mr. Schiff. You and I are both familiar with them. I've reached no conclusions, and I would advise you to not reach any conclusions either until we reach the end. There are 20 more witnesses. So I'll agree not to reach any conclusions if you'll do the same. With that, Madam Secretary, regardless of where he ranked in the order of advisors, it is undisputed that a significant number of your emails were to or from a Sidney Blumenthal. Now, he did not work for the State Department. He didn't work for the U.S. government at all. He wanted to work for the State Department, but the White House said no to him. Do you recall who specifically at the White House rejected Sidney Blumenthal?
No, I do not.
After he was turned down for a job at the State Department by the White House, he went to work where?
I think he had a number of consulting contracts with different entities.
Well, if he had a number of them, do you recall any of them?
I know that he did some work for my husband.
Well, he worked for the Clinton Foundation.
That's correct.
Okay. He worked for Media Matters.
I'm sure he did.
He worked for Correct the Record.
I'm sure he did.
When you were asked about Sidney Blumenthal, you said he was an old friend who sent you unsolicited emails, which you passed on in some instances because you wanted to hear from people outside what you called the bubble. We will ignore for a second whether or not Sidney Blumenthal is outside the bubble, but I do want to ask you about a couple of those other comments, because what you left out was that he was an old friend who knew absolutely nothing about Libya, was critical of President Obama and others that you work with, loved to send you political and image advice, had business interests in Libya, which he not only alerted you to, but solicited your help for. And you often forwarded his emails, but usually only after you redacted out any identifier so nobody knew where the information was coming from. What does the word unsolicited mean to you?
It means that I did not ask him to send me the information that he sent me, and as I have previously stated, some of it I found interesting, some of it I did not, some of it I forwarded, some of it I did not. I did not know anything about any business interests. I thought that, just as I said previously, newspaper articles, journalists, of which he is one, a former journalist, had some interesting insights. And so we took them on board and evaluated them, and some were helpful and others were not.
We're going to get to all the points you just made, but I want to start with your public comment that these emails were unsolicited. You wrote to him, "Another keeper, thanks and please keep them coming. Greetings from Kabul and thanks for keeping this stuff coming. Any other info about it? Question mark. What are you hearing now? Question mark. Got it. We'll follow up tomorrow. Anything else to convey? Question mark." Now, that one is interesting because that was the very email where Mr. Blumenthal was asking you to intervene on behalf of a business deal that he was pursuing in Libya. What did you mean by what are you hearing now?
I have no idea, Congressman. They started out unsolicited, and as I said, some were of interest. I passed them on, and some were not. And so he continued to provide me information that was made available to him.
I don't want to parse words, and I don't want to be hyper-technical, because it's not a huge point, but it is an important point. You didn't say they started off unsolicited. You said they were. You said they were unsolicited.
Well, they were unsolicited, but obviously I did respond to some of them.
Well,
And I'm sure that
Anything
encouraged him.
Anything else to convey? What are you hearing now? I'm going to Paris tomorrow night. We'll meet with TNC leaders, so this and additional info useful. Still don't have electricity or BlackBerry coverage post-Irene, so I've had to resort to my new iPad. Let me know if you received this. We'll talk about the new iPad in a little bit. Here's another one. This report is in part a response to your questions. That's an email from him to you. This report is in part a response to your questions. There'll be further information in the next day. If you're the one asking him for information, how does that square with the definition of unsolicited?
I said it began that way, Mr. Chairman, and I will add that both Chris Stevens and Gene Kretz found some of the information interesting, far more than I could, because they knew some of the characters who were being mentioned, and they were the ones, the kind of persons with the expertise that I asked to evaluate to see whether there was any useful information.
We're going to get to that in a second. Now, before you give Mr. Blumenthal too much credit, you agree he didn't write a single one of those cables or memos he sent you.
I'm sorry, what?
He didn't write a single one of those cables or memos.
I don't know who wrote them. He's the one who sent them to me.
Would you be surprised to know not a single one of those was from him?
I don't know where he got the information that he was sending to me.
Did you ask? You're sending me very specific, detailed intelligence. What is your source? That seems to me like a pretty good question.
I did learn later that he was talking to or sharing information from former American intelligence officials.
By the name of? Who wrote those cables?
I don't recall. I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
You had his information passed on to others, but at least on one occasion you asked Ms. Abedine, can you print without any identifiers? Why would you want his name removed?
Because I thought that it would be more important to just look at the substance and to make a determination as to whether or not there was anything to it.
Well, don't people have a right to know the source of the information so they can determine credibility?
But he wasn't, as you just said, the source of the information. But
you didn't know that, Madam Secretary, and that's what you just said.
No, Mr. Chairman. I knew that he didn't have the sources to provide that information. I knew he was getting it from somewhere else. Whether he knew a lot of journalists, he knew others in Washington. It could have been a variety of people.
Well, if you're going to determine credibility, don't you want to know the source?
Well, it wasn't credibility so much as trying to follow the threads that were mentioned about individuals. And as I already stated, some of it was useful and some of it was not.
Well, did the president know that Mr. Blumenthal was advising you?
He wasn't advising me. And, you know,
Did he know that he was your most prolific emailer that we have found on the subjects of Libya and Benghazi?
That's because I didn't do most of my work
That's
about
fair.
Libya on
I'm
email.
not challenging that, Madam Secretary. I am not challenging that. All I'm telling you is the documents show he was your most prolific emailer on Libya and Benghazi. And my question to you is, did the president, the same White House that said you can't handle him, can't hire him, did he know that he was advising you?
He was not advising me, and I have no reason to have ever mentioned that or know that the president knew that.
All right, I want to draw your attention to an email about Libya from Mr. Blumenthal to you, dated April 2011. It will be Exhibit 67. And this is informative. Should we pass on, and in parentheticals, unidentified to the White House? If you were going to pass something on to the White House, why would you take off the identifiers?
Because it was important to evaluate the information, and from a lot of intelligence that I have certainly reviewed over the years, you often don't have the source of the intelligence. You look at the intelligence and you try to determine whether or not it is credible, whether it can be followed up on.
Well, I'm going to accept the fact that you and I come from different backgrounds, because I can tell you that an unsourced comment could never be uttered in any courtroom. You have
We're not talking about courtrooms, Mr. Chairman.
No,
we're talking about intelligence.
No, we're talking about credibility and the ability to assess who a source is, and whether or not that source has ever been to Libya, knows anything about Libya, or has business interest in Libya, all of which would be important if you were going to determine the credibility, which I think is why you probably took his information off of what you sent to the White House. But here's another possible explanation that may give us a sense of why maybe the White House didn't want you to hire him in the first place. In one email, he wrote this about the President's Secretary of Defense: I infer Gates' problem is losing an internal debate. Tyler, and by the way, Tyler's Tyler Drumheller, that's who actually authored the cables that you got from Mr. Blumenthal. Tyler knows him well and says he's a mean, vicious little, I'm not going to say the word, but he did. This is an email from Blumenthal to you about the President's Secretary of Defense. And here's another Blumenthal email to you about President's National Security Advisor. Frankly, Tom Donilon's babbling rhetoric about narratives on a phone briefing of reporters on March the 10th has inspired derision among serious foreign policy analysts, both here and abroad. And here's another one from what you say is your old friend, Sidney Blumenthal. This is a quote from him. I would say Obama, and by the way, he left the president part out, I would say Obama appears to be intent on seizing defeat from the jaws of victory. He and his political cronies in the White House and Chicago are, to say the least, unenthusiastic about regime change in Libya. Obama's lukewarm and self-contradicting statements have produced what is, at least for the moment, operational paralysis. I think that may give us a better understanding of why the White House may have told you you cannot hire him. Blumenthal could not get hired by our government, didn't pass any background check at all, had no role with our government, had never been to Libya, had no expertise in Libya, was critical of the president and others that you worked with, shared polling data with you on the intervention in Libya, gave you political advice on how to take credit for Libya, all the while working for the Clinton Foundation and some pseudo-news entities. And, Madam Secretary, he had unfettered access to you. And he used that access, at least on one occasion, to ask you to intervene on behalf of a business venture. Do you recall that?
You know, Mr. Chairman, if you don't have any friends who say unkind things privately, I congratulate you. But from my perspective,
I'd like to think I'd correct them.
I don't know what this line of questioning does to help us get to the bottom of the deaths for Americans.
I'll be happy to help you understand that, Madam Secretary.
But I want to reiterate what I said to Congresswoman Sanchez. These were originally unsolicited. You've just said that perhaps the main, if not the exclusive author, was a former intelligence agent for our country who rose to the highest levels of the CIA and who was given credit for being one of the very few who pointed out that the intelligence used by the Bush administration to go to war in Iraq was wrong. So I think that, you know, the sharing of information from an old friend that I did not take at face value, that I sent on to those who were experts, is something that, you know, makes sense, but it was certainly not in any way the primary source of or the predominant understanding that we had of what was going on in Libya and what we needed to be doing.
Well, Madam Secretary, I'm out of time, and we'll pick this back up the next round, but I'll go ahead and let you know ahead of time why it's relevant. It's relevant because our ambassador was asked to read and respond to Sidney Blumenthal's drivel. It was sent to him to read and react to. In some instances, on the very same day he was asking for security. So I think it is eminently fair to ask,